I still remember the strobe lights flashing across the crowded dance floor when I first saw her. It was a sweaty summer night in a packed club in downtown Phoenix, the kind of place where the bass thumps so hard you feel it in your chest. Her name was Lena, tall, with sharp green eyes and a laugh that cut through the noise like a lifeline. I was 25, fresh out of a dead-end retail job, chasing something bigger. She was 23, a barista with dreams of opening her own cafe. We clicked, instantly like two puzzle pieces snapping together. By the end of that night, I'd convinced her to crash at my tiny apartment instead of heading home. 3 days later, she never left. Life moved fast after that. We were reckless, young, and stupidly in love. Within 6 weeks, we'd pooled our savings and rented a cramped loft overlooking the desert skyline. 8 months in, I proposed. Nothing fancy, just a cheap ring from a pawn shop and a promise to build a future together. She said yes, tears streaking her mascara, and we tied the knot in a courthouse with 2 strangers as witnesses. A year later, our daughter, Mia, arrived, tiny, loud, and perfect. I was over the moon, juggling diaper duty with my new gig as a delivery driver. 4 years after that, our son, Ethan, came along, screaming his way into the world. Suddenly, I was a dad of 2, and the pressure was on. I didn't just want to scrape by, I wanted us to thrive. So I started hustling. I picked up extra shifts, then landed a side job fixing up old cars in a buddy's garage. Eventually, I scraped together enough cash to launch my own auto repair shop, Desert Wheels, right off Route 66. It was a grind, 12-hour days, oil-stained hands, and endless paperwork. I was spinning like a hamster on a wheel, but I told myself it was worth it. Lena saw me pouring my soul into it. She had to know I was doing this for us, right? For Mia's dance lessons, Ethan's preschool, a house with a yard instead of that dusty loft. I thought she got it. 7 years in, the shop was finally taking off. We'd just landed a contract with a local dealership, big money, steady work. I was 32 now, Lena was 30, and life felt like it was falling into place. That's when the bomb dropped. I came home late one night expecting her to be asleep on the couch with the kids' toys scattered around. Instead, she was sitting at the kitchen table, arms crossed, her eyes cold as ice. "I'm leaving," she said, flat and final. My stomach twisted. Before I could ask why, she hit me with it. She'd been seeing my business partner, Greg. Greg, 47, balding with a smug grin. I'd always hated. She said I'd been too busy for her, that she was done waiting. Done waiting? I'd been killing myself for this family. The betrayal stung like a slap. Greg wasn't just some guy. He'd been my mentor, the one who'd co-signed the loan for the shop. We'd built Desert Wheels together, and now he was tearing my life apart. I stood there numb, as Lena packed a bag and walked out, leaving me with the kids and a half-empty fridge. Mia asked where Mommy was going. I didn't have an answer. All I had was rage, white-hot and boiling over. They thought I'd just roll over and take it. They had no idea what I was capable of. Looking back, I should have seen the cracks. Lena's late nights running errands, Greg's weird comments about keeping her company. But I was too buried in invoices and engine parts to notice. Now here I was, blindsided in my own kitchen. I poured a glass of whiskey and stared at the wall, my mind racing. This wasn't the end. It was the start of something else. Something they'd never see coming. I wasn't just going to lose everything I'd built. Not to them. Not like this. The days after Lena walked out felt like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I'd sit in the living room of our Phoenix loft, staring at the saggy couch where she used to sprawl out with a glass of cheap wine, and wonder how it all went so wrong. Mia, now 6, kept asking when Mommy was coming home. Ethan, barely 3, just toddled around, oblivious, banging toy trucks against the coffee table. I'd mutter something vague to Mia about Mommy needing a break, but inside I was the mess. My wife, my partner for 7 years, had ditched me for Greg, the guy I'd trusted with my business. It wasn't just a punch to the gut. It was a sledgehammer. I tried to keep it together for the kids. Mornings, I'd slap peanut butter on toast, pack Mia's lunchbox with a juice pouch and a slightly bruised apple, and drop them at daycare, before hauling myself to Desert Wheels. The shop was my lifeline now, my one shot at proving I could still hold things together. But every time I walked in, I'd see Greg's empty desk in the corner. He hadn't shown up since Lena left. Probably. Holed up with her somewhere, laughing at how they'd played me. The guys in the garage noticed too. "Where's Greg at, boss?" they'd ask, wrench in hand. I'd shrug and say he was taking time off, but the bitterness in my voice gave me away. That's when I started digging. I wasn't about to let this slide, not without knowing the full story. Late at night after the kids were asleep, I'd sit at the kitchen table with my laptop, scrolling through bank statements and emails. Something felt off. Greg had always handled the shop's finances, said it was his thing since I was better with the hands-on stuff. I'd trusted him, stupidly, blindly. Then I found it. A withdrawal, $15,000, pulled from the business account 2 weeks before Lena left. No invoice, no explanation, just gone. My heart sank. Had they been planning this? Was my own money funding their getaway? I confronted Lena the next day. She'd been crashing at her sister's place in Tucson, an hour's drive south. I dropped the kids with a neighbor and showed up unannounced, banging on the door until she answered. She looked tired, her green eyes dull, wearing one of my old flannel shirts like a slap in the face. "What do you want, Jake?" she snapped. I held up my phone, showing the bank statement. "Where's the money, Lena? What did Greg do with it?" She froze, then rolled her eyes. "You're paranoid. It's not what you think." But her voice wavered, and I knew she was lying. I pushed past her, demanding answers, but she just screamed at me to leave. Neighbors peeked out their windows. I stormed off, fuming. Back home, I started piecing it together. Little things I'd ignored came rushing back, like how Lena had stopped complaining about my long hours a few months ago, back when I thought she'd finally accepted the grind. Or how Greg had offered to check in on her when I was stuck late at the shop. I'd thanked him for it, like an idiot. Now, it hit me. Those check-ins weren't innocent. I pulled up my phone records next. Dozens of calls between them going back 6 months. Late-night chats while I was elbow-deep in engine grease, thinking I was building our future. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was calculated. I couldn't sleep that night. The loft felt too quiet without Lena's soft snoring, just the hum of the fridge and Ethan's occasional murmurs from his crib. I paced the living room, replaying every moment, every lie. My hands shook as I poured coffee at 3 a.m., the bitterness matching my mood. I wasn't just hurt. I was angry. Angry at Lena for tossing our family aside. Angry at Greg for stabbing me in the back. Angry at myself for not seeing it sooner. But anger's a funny thing. It sharpens you. I wasn't going to let them win. Not my shop, not my kids, not my life. By morning I had a plan. It was risky, maybe even ruthless, but they'd pushed me too far. I glanced at Mia's crayon drawings, taped to the fridge, stick figures of us four smiling under a yellow sun. That's what I was fighting for. They thought they'd broken me. They were dead wrong. The next few days were a blur of rage and caffeine. I'd sit in the dim glow of my laptop, digging deeper into the mess Lena and Greg had left behind, while Mia and Ethan slept down the hall. The Phoenix heat pressed against the loft's windows, making the air feel thick and suffocating. I couldn't shake the image of Lena in my flannel, brushing off that $15,000 like it was nothing. Or Greg's smug face, probably counting my money somewhere with her. I wasn't just losing my wife. I was losing everything I'd bled for. But to understand how it got this bad, I had to look back. I met Greg 5 years ago at a car show in Flagstaff. I was 27, still hustling odd jobs, when he rolled up in a restored '67 Mustang, all chrome and swagger. He was 42 then, a mechanic turned entrepreneur with a knack for turning failing shops around. We hit it off over beers and engine talk. He saw something in me, grit maybe, and offered to partner up. I'd run the garage, he'd handle the books. A year later, Desert Wheels was born. I thought he was a godsend. Now I saw him for what he was, a snake waiting to strike. Lena was different back then. When we started, she'd bring me coffee at the shop, perched on a stool in her ripped jeans, teasing me about my greasy hands. She'd sketch cafe logos on napkins, dreaming aloud about her own place. After Mia was born, she stayed home, but she'd still pop by with the baby, all smiles. I thought we were a team. Even when Ethan came along and I got busier, she'd nod when I apologized for late nights, saying, "I get it, Jake. You're doing this for us." I believed her. Maybe I was too tired to see the cracks forming. Those cracks started showing about a year ago. I'd come home exhausted and Lena would be quiet, too quiet. No more playful jabs or cafe talk. She'd stare at her phone, texting someone, and brush it off when I asked. I figured it was mom stuff. Playdates, daycare chats. Meanwhile, Greg was getting chummy. He'd linger after closing, cracking beers with me, asking about Lena. "She holding up okay with you, gone so much?" he'd say, casual-like. I'd say, "Oh," laugh it off, say she was tough. He'd nod, but there was this glint in his eye I didn't catch then. Hindsight's a brutal teacher. Now with that $15,000 hole staring me in the face, I saw it all. The late-night calls. The errands Lena ran while I was at the shop. Greg's sudden business trips that never made sense. They'd been playing me for months, maybe longer. I pulled up more records, credit card statements this time. There it was, charges at a motel in Scottsdale, dinners at places we never went as a family. My stomach churned. I pictured them laughing over steak while I was home reheating leftovers and reading Mia bedtime stories. The betrayal wasn't just a knife. It was a chainsaw ripping through 7 years of trust. I couldn't face the shop that week. I called in sick, left my foreman in charge, and holed up in the loft. The kids kept me sane. Mia's chatter about school, Ethan's sticky hugs. But alone, my mind spiraled. I'd pace the kitchen, clenching my fists, imagining confronting Greg, smashing his stupid Mustang, dragging him through the dirt. Then Lena, her cold stare, her excuses. I wanted to scream, to break something. Instead, I'd slump on the couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering how I'd missed it all. By Friday, I was done wallowing. I had to know more. I drove to Desert Wheels after hours, let myself in with my key, and rifled through Greg's desk. Buried under invoices was a crumpled receipt. Some bar in Tucson, dated a month back. $80 tab, 2 people. My hands shook as I stuffed it in my pocket. Then I found a notebook, scribbled dates, numbers, and L next to them. Lena. It wasn't proof, but it was blood in the water. They were sloppy, cocky. That was their mistake. I locked up and sat in my truck, the desert night pressing in. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't breathe right. This wasn't just about money or love, it was war, and I was ready to fight dirty. They'd underestimated me. That was about to change. The notebook from Greg's desk burned a hole in my pocket all weekend. I'd sit in the loft, staring at those scribbled dates and L initials, my mind racing. The Phoenix sun baked the city outside, but inside, I was ice cold, focused. I wasn't just some chump they could rob blind and ditch. I'd built Desert Wheels from nothing, raised 2 kids through sleepless nights, and I'd be damned if Lena and Greg got to walk away with my life in their pockets. By Monday, I'd made up my mind. It was time to hit back. First, I called my lawyer, Sam, a grizzled guy I'd met fixing his old Chevy. I laid it all out. The missing $15,000, the affair, Lena leaving. I showed him the notebook, the receipt, the bank statements. He leaned back in his creaky chair, chewing a toothpick, and said, "Jake, this is messy, but we've got leverage. Greg's name's on the business too. He can't just siphon cash without consequences." Sam filed an emergency motion to freeze the shop's accounts and started digging into Greg's finances. It felt good, like the first swing in a fight. I'd been itching to start. Next, I went for the jugular. I'd remembered something Greg bragged about years ago, how he'd dodged taxes on a side gig before we met. If he was sloppy with my money, maybe he was sloppy elsewhere. I hired a PI, a wiry dude named Tony, to tail him. Tony didn't come cheap, but I cashed out a chunk of my savings. 2 days later, he called. "Your boy's living large in Tucson," he said. "Rented a condo with your ex, driving a new SUV. Cash payments, no paper trail." Then the kicker. Found some shady deposits in his personal account, offshore stuff. Looks like he's been skimming more than just your shop. My blood boiled. Greg wasn't just a backstabber. He was a thief on a whole other level. I didn't stop there. I drove to Tucson myself that night, the kids with a sitter, my truck rattling down the highway. Tony had texted me the address, a sleek condo complex near the foothills. I parked across the street watching. Around 9 p.m., Greg's SUV rolled up. He stepped out, laughing. Then Lena climbed out the passenger side, her hair catching the street light. They looked happy, too happy. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white. Part of me wanted to ram his car right there. Instead, I snapped photos, my phone shaking in my hand. Evidence. Sam would love this. Back home, I barely slept. Mia woke up crying from a nightmare, and I held her on the couch, promising monsters weren't real. But they were. They just wore familiar faces. By morning, Sam called with news. The account freeze went through, and he'd filed a lawsuit against Greg for embezzlement. "We're claiming half the business's value plus damages," he said. "And with the kids, you've got a shot at custody." Lena's not exactly stable, shacking up with this clown. It was a lifeline, but it wasn't enough. I wanted them to hurt like I did. That's when Tony dropped the real bomb. He'd tracked Greg's offshore account to a shell company. One, tied to a shady auto parts supplier we'd used. Greg had been overbilling Desert Wheels for years, pocketing the difference. Thousands more, maybe tens of thousands, gone. I sat there stunned, the phone pressed to my ear. This wasn't just betrayal, it was a heist. Tony chuckled darkly. "Guy's got balls, I'll give him that, but he's sloppy. I've got records. You want me to keep digging?" I didn't hesitate. Yes. I spent that afternoon at the shop pretending everything was fine. The guys bantered over a busted transmission, grease smudged on their faces, while I smiled and nodded like my world wasn't imploding. Inside, I was plotting. Greg thought he'd outsmarted me. Lena thought she'd traded up. They were wrong. I had proof now, hard, cold proof, and I wasn't just going to take back what was mine. I was going to bury them with it. As the sun dipped below the desert horizon, I stood outside Desert Wheels staring at the sign I'd painted myself years ago. This was my turf, my fight. They'd pushed me to the edge, but I wasn't falling. I was climbing back, with a vengeance, and they had no idea what was coming. The next week was a storm I'd unleashed myself. I stood in the eye of it, calm on the outside, but inside, I was a furnace of fury and focus. Phoenix shimmered under a brutal heat wave, but I barely felt it. Every move I made was ice cold and deliberate. Sam, my lawyer, was moving fast. The lawsuit against Greg hit him like a freight train, embezzlement, fraud, the works. Tony's evidence, those offshore accounts and fake invoices, was the fuel. I wasn't just fighting for Desert Wheels anymore. This was about taking back my dignity, my kids' future, everything they'd tried to rip away. I started with the high chop. With Greg's name still on the lease, I couldn't kick him out legally, yet, but I could make it mine again. I spent a day with my foreman, Carlos, auditing every tool, every job log. We found more of Greg's fingerprints, parts ordered, but never delivered, cash jobs unrecorded. Carlos shook his head, muttering, "Man's a leech, Jake." I nodded, jaw tight. By nightfall, I'd changed the locks and updated the security codes. Greg wasn't stepping foot in my garage again, not without a fight. Then came Lena. She called me the day the lawsuit papers landed, her voice shrill through the phone. "What? The hell, Jake? You're suing Greg, dragging me into this?" I could hear panic behind her anger. "Good. You dragged yourself in," I shot back. "You think I'd let him steal from me, from Mia and Ethan, and just shrug it off? You picked him, Lena. Live with it." She sputtered, then hung up. I smirked, but it faded fast. Mia's quiet. "I miss Mommy" at breakfast still echoed. In my head, this wasn't fun, it was survival. Sam pushed for custody next. He argued Lena's instability, leaving her kids shacking up with a crook, made her unfit. I hated using Mia and Ethan like chess pieces, but I'd seen the alternative. Greg's condo, his sleazy hands near my kids. No way. I met Sam at the courthouse, my tie crooked, palms sweaty. The judge granted temporary custody pending a hearing. I drove home with Mia and Ethan that night, their chatter filling the truck. For a moment I felt light, like I'd won something. Then I saw Lena's old coffee mug on the counter, and the weight crashed back. Tony called late that night, his voice low and urgent. "Greg's spooked," he said. "He's liquidating assets, selling that SUV, moving cash. Looks like he's planning to bolt." My pulse spiked. If Greg ran, he'd take my money with him. Maybe Lena too. I couldn't let that happen. "Find out where he's going," I told Tony. "I need him pinned." I hung up, pacing the loft, the kids asleep in their rooms. The walls felt too close, the air too still. I grabbed a beer, cracked it open, and stood by the window staring at the city lights. This was it, the final push. By Friday, it all collided. Tony tracked Greg to a dive bar in Tucson, meeting some shady guy, probably a buyer for his dirty cash. I told Sam, who alerted the cops. They raided the bar that night. Greg was caught red-handed, stacks of bills in a duffel bag, his face pale as they cuffed him. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. Tony sent me a photo. Greg, head down, shoved into a squad car. I stared at it, feeling at nothing, no triumph, no relief, just a hollow ache. He'd gambled everything and lost. But what about me? Lena showed up at the loft the next morning, unannounced. Her eyes were red, her hair a mess. "They arrested him, Jake," she said, voice cracking. "What did you do?" I stepped aside, letting her in, my face stone. "What I had to," I said. "He stole from us, you helped him." She sank onto the couch, sobbing. "I didn't know about the money, not all of it. I was lonely." I wanted to yell, to shake her. Instead, I stood there silent, as Mia peeked out. From her room, wide-eyed. Lena saw her, reached out, but Mia ran to me. That broke something in me, and in her. I looked at Lena, crumpled and small, and realized this was the end game. Greg was down, she was broken, but I wasn't done. Not yet. There was one more move to make. Lena's sobs echoed through the loft that morning, a sound I'd once have run to fix. Now I just stood there, Mia clinging to my leg, her little hands tight around my jeans. The Phoenix sun streamed through the blinds, harsh and unforgiving, lighting up the wreckage of what we'd been. Lena looked up, mascara streaking her face, and whispered, "I'm sorry, Jake." I messed up. I wanted to believe her. Part of me still loved the girl I'd met in that club. But sorry didn't undo the lies, the theft, the nights I'd spent alone wondering where she was. I had one last card to play, and it wasn't forgiveness. Greg's arrest had flipped the board. The cops had him on fraud, money laundering, the whole ugly mess Tony uncovered. Desert Wheels was safe. Sam pushed through a court order stripping Greg's name from the business, leaving me sole owner. The $15,000 was gone, but I'd rebuilt worse from less. Lena, though, she was a loose end. I'd won custody, temporary for now, but she still had rights. I couldn't risk her dragging Mia and Ethan into whatever mess she'd stumble into next. So I made a choice, one they'd never see coming. I sat her down that afternoon after Mia and Ethan were at daycare. The loft smelled of stale coffee and kids' cereal, a weirdly normal backdrop for what I was about to do. Lena, I said, voice steady, you've got two options. Walk away clean, sign over full custody, leave us alone. Or I tell the cops everything. She blinked, confused. Everything? I pulled out my phone, opened a file Tony had sent weeks ago, and slid it across the table. Photos, texts, proof she'd known about Greg's skimming. Small stuff at first, then bigger. She'd even wired him cash from our joint account once, thinking I wouldn't notice. Her face went white. You wouldn't, she stammered. I leaned in. Try me. She stared at the screen, then at me, like she was seeing a stranger. Maybe she was. The old Jake would have caved, patched things up for the kid's sake. But that Jake died the night she walked out. You'd ruin me, she said, voice trembling. You ruined yourself, I replied. I'm just cleaning up. She signed the papers that night, shaky hands, no words. Sam filed them the next day. Full custody, no visitation unless I allowed it. Lena was out of our lives, legally, permanently. I thought that'd be the end. I was wrong. A week later, I was at Desert Wheels, elbow deep in a carburetor when Carlos waved me over. Some guy dropped this off, he said, handing me an envelope. No name, just my address scrawled on it. Inside was a cashier's check, $50,000 and a note. Take it and forget everything, G. My stomach dropped. Greg, out on bail, desperate, trying to buy my silence. I could have cashed it, paid off debts, given Mia and Ethan a cushion. But that wasn't me anymore. I called Tony. He's running, I said, find him. Tony tracked him to a motel near the Mexican border 2 days later. I tipped off the cops, anonymous, untraceable. They nabbed him trying to cross, the check still in my possession as evidence. Greg's bail was revoked, and the charges piled higher. I burned the note, cashed the check into a trust for the kids, and walked away. He'd thought he could outmaneuver me again. He'd thought wrong. That night I took Mia and Ethan to a diner off Route 66. Greasy burgers, sticky booths, the works. Mia giggled over her fries. Ethan smeared ketchup on his shirt, and for the first time in months I laughed, really laughed. The weight was lifting. Lena was gone, Greg was finished. Desert Wheels was mine. But as we drove home, Mia asked, Daddy, are we okay now? I smiled, said, Yeah, kiddo, we're golden. Then my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. You think you won. Look closer. My blood ran cold. I pulled over, staring at the screen. The loft was dark when we got back, but something felt off. The air too still, a shadow wrong. I checked every room, heart pounding. Nothing. Maybe paranoia, maybe not. Then I saw it taped to the fridge under Mia's drawings. A photo of me taken that morning outside the diner. Someone was watching. And this wasn't over. That's the end of today's story. Did things turn out the way you thought? Or were there some surprises along the way? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what you think. If you enjoyed this journey, don't forget to hit the like button. And if you haven't joined the community yet, now's the perfect time. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you're always the first to catch new stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next adventure.